Am I still muted or can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you. Okay, so this really is quite a difficult letter in many ways, the second letter to the Corinthians. Paul's second letter to Corinth was written either in 55 or 56 AD. This, by the way, is on the website, so in print already if you want to see it, but that doesn't absolve you from listening. The correspondence post-dates Paul's first letter to Corinth. That much seems certain from the internal evidence of the correspondence itself. But most scholars accept that the letter as we have it was not written all of a piece, as are Romans and 1 Corinthians, but that we probably have 4 answers to the Corinthians' letters back to Paul, which were written as a result of the receipt of the first letter to the Corinthians, or something like it, as we know it. The divisions in the current text are from chapter 1 verse 1 to chapter 7 verse 16. There seems to be a break there. However, from 6:14 to 7:1, they seem to be also completely separate from the rest of that unit. And then 8:1 to 9:15 and 10:1 to 13:13. I'm going quickly so that you don't try and find them. If you try and find them, it will drive you mad. And they're not the important thing about the letter either. The reason scholars beg leave to doubt that these form a coherent single narrative is that at those points there is a rapid and unwarned about, unmediated change of subject and/or a vast change of tone. Sometimes what Paul says in one bit does appear to contradict what he said in the other, as if he was saying, oh, well, yes, but I didn't mean that. What I meant is blah, blah, blah. And actually, that's a very human thing to do, isn't it? I do that often, sometimes halfway through a sermon. You've said something you didn't quite mean, and you need to be able to pull it back and put it right and correct it and go on from there. It's as if Paul were doing that. Most scholars do not seriously doubt that most of it is by Paul, and that the arrival of another letter from part or the whole of the congregation has prompted Paul to add more. I don't suppose Paul's congregation was they would have been all that more disciplined about listening to the answer and then responding to it as the average group of enraged Methodists is when dealing with the issues that currently face us as a church. We have seen that he did so in the letter to the Galatians, looked back, changed his mind, and wrote another bit. In fact, we know that in Galatians, in chapter 6, if you remember, where he says, you see these big letters, we know that he's writing himself, writing in person, not using his scribe or amanuensis or whatever it was. So we know that Paul did that. And it does seem that this final letter, this letter to the Corinthians, really has done that, has achieved that. However, 6:14 to 7:1 appears to me to be so very different. It tends in a completely different direction to the bits around it. And it also doesn't partake of the same kind of Greek that Paul used in the other passages, in fact, anywhere else, really. And many do therefore believe that this may be an additional passage put into the letter, actually by somebody else. But it's a very short passage. It's one of the most negative passages in any of Paul's writing, which is why I don't think it's really him. But there's nothing internally. You can't say, well, look, this is on another bit of paper, because we don't know what bits of paper or parchment or whatever he wrote on in the first place, or papyrus, possibly papyrus, in fact. Other scholars find even more reason to doubt the unity of even these sections. I mean, some scholars go an awful lot further than that. I myself am quite conservative about the authorship of this letter. As we shall see, the main material bears his hallmarks. He did not wield the rule book over the congregation. He did not have CPD on the front desk at the church council, just in case he needed to refer to it, because there was no CPD to refer to in those days. He did not say, this is the rule and this is what you must do. And when he does say that, actually, you need to look again and see whether he is saying that, because that's really quite unlike Paul. He did as he always has done and goes at things from first principles with the demands of the love of God in front of his face. So the letter divides. First 2 chapters, up to the end of verse 13 of chapter 2, are about Paul's plans and God's plan and how those two appear to dovetail with each other. And then from 2 to 6 at 13, that purpose of God's and of Paul's is expressed in mission and ministry, which I think is the really interesting bit of the letter. 6:14 to 7:4 is about keeping away from the temptations of this world. But from verse 5 of 7, Paul returns to his plans, specifically as they affect Corinth and their working out in the future. And including in that is that chapter 7 verse 5 to 9 verse 15, including in that is the collection for the saints, that's to say the Christians at Jerusalem. And then from 10:1 to 13:10, reaction to the news that has there's his reaction to the news that has reached Paul as the future is suddenly threatened by a counter mission from someone or other. And then chapter 13 verses 11 to verse 13 is his final last words and greeting, very short. And of course the greeting is incredibly well known to us, because practically many church services finish with 2 Corinthians 13:13, because that's the grace. This probably is the most personal, but also the most theological letter Paul ever wrote. In this letter, he wears his heart on his sleeve. Now, when I was training for ministry, and actually almost everybody universally had said up to that point, this is the 1980s, don't wear your heart on your sleeve. You need a certain distance from your congregations. Don't make friends with them. Allow them to be the people that they are, and don't have personal favourites. The only part of that advice I actually agree with is the very last bit. And that's about not having personal favourites, or at least not being seen to have personal favourites. You do have sometimes to wear your heart on your sleeve. You do have sometimes to show that you are a person with feelings about what's going on around you. And you do have sometimes to express those feelings in as firm a way as you possibly can. And Paul did that. He tried in 1 Corinthians saying what ought to be done. In 2 Corinthians, he doesn't so much do that as to say, but this just isn't Christianity. You really have got to try and be like this. And therefore he expresses what he has been and done for the sake of his congregation. Now, I think that has a relevance and an importance, not just in the context of this letter, but to ministry in general. And I do not care for this purpose whether you're somebody who's been ordained, or whether you're somebody who is a local preacher, or whether you're somebody who is a circuit steward, or a local church steward, or a secretary, or an ordinary common or garden church member. Ministry is not something confined to any one class of persons, not just presbyters and deacons. It is us all together who need to hear what Paul has got to say in this letter. And not just the theology itself, but the way he does his theology is really important. He does his theology contextually. He does it as part of what he's trying to do as a minister of the gospel. He does it not in theory and in a back room. He's not Karl Barth writing 17 volumes of church dogmatics. He is engaged. And the theology comes out when he is engaged. Now, did it work? Well, 2 Corinthians leaves us in a bit of a quandary, because there we are, chapter 13 starts off part of the reaction to the news that has reached Paul that the future is threatened by some counter mission or other. And we know no more. But we do know that in about 90 to 100 AD, Clement, who was the fourth pope, the third after Peter himself, the Bishop of Rome, wrote to the Corinthians, not because they had a problem, and not because there was a difficulty, but as part of his pastoral duties. So the church at Corinth had not failed. It had survived. And the tone of his writing is not correctional over more than minor points. It is warm, and it is sunny, and it is affirming. So Paul's strategy of being so personal, of exposing himself, if you will, just as he did in the Corinthians, of speaking in terms fairly tough and heavy theology, does indeed appear to have worked. If you want to follow that, there's a lovely little penguin book called Early Christian Writings, which is basically, these are the bits that could have got into the New Testament, but didn't. Some of them are excellent, and the letters of Clement is quite near the beginning. Clement of Rome, it's labelled. There you are. Harmony and cooperation are lessons which nature itself teaches us. That's pretty gentle. That's not Paul writing, is it? But that he could write in those terms is a testimony. There's a nice little book called Pauline Christianity by John Ziesler, who is a Methodist. Very good little book. Oxford Bible Series. There's Phil Kingsley Barrett's commentary on the second letter to the Corinthians. And if you want to know where I get my facts from, it's a thick book, SCM Press, by Mr. Kummel, called Introduction to the New Testament, and it's got introductions and basic facts about every book in the New Testament, even Philemon. although it won't actually tell you what the situation behind Philemon was. You still have to guess. That's all I've got to say. So if you'd like to unmute